Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. So today we're doing this co-hosting myself and Carolyn Jennings. I'm Luis Pessoa. I'm here at the University of Maryland, College Park in the DC area. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology. I do human neuroimaging, neuroscience work, but interested in conceptual issues. But I'm not a philosopher. But Carolyn is an associate professor of philosophy and cognitive science at UC Merced. And she is the author of The Attending Mind from Cambridge University Press. That was in 2020. And I think you have at least one more already. Yeah, you have a book coming up on attention and consciousness, or?
Attention and mental control.
Attention and mental control. The consciousness is later. You're going to solve it all for us a little later. And yeah, so we're very excited today to have Michael Silberstein, who is a professor of philosophy at Elizabethtown College. And he's the author, together with Robert Bishop and Mark Pexton, of Emergency in Context from Oxford University Press. And so Michael is going to be, yes, it's right there on the screen. And Michael is going to be presenting in 35 minutes today, in 30 or so minutes today. He's going to try to give a general overview of how I should say, reconceptualization or conceptualization of emergence in context can be used as a way to frame and understand and discuss issues of consciousness. So we have a big challenge today. So Michael, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you, Luis, and thank you, Carolyn, for inviting me. So this talk is based on a 65-page paper, and I have 35 minutes. So if you've seen Dr. Strangelove, this is going to be like the dude writing the A-bomb down to the ground, but hopefully it will end better. And as Luis said, I have a new book out. There's a lot of stuff in here. I've been writing over the years a lot on network stuff and neuroscience, and some on consciousness, and I'm trying to put some of it together. This book has more than just neuroscience stuff in it, but all this is a long con to get you to buy this book. So if you'll all just to agree to buy this book, we can all just back away slowly. Hopefully this talk will persuade you to do that. So here's what I'm allegedly going to do in 35 minutes. I think it's highly unlikely, but anybody is welcome to these slides, and they're welcome to the paper that this talk is based on. So that is the story. We begin with the heart of the generation problem. Not going to spend any time talking about that. I'm going to assume we all know what that is. If you make these four assumptions, you get this thing called the heart problem or the generation problem. Generation problem is how do brains generate consciousness. And if you buy into these four assumptions, that seems highly problematic. In fact, it's worse than that. I would say the heart problem is not just hard, it's impossible. It's designed to be impossible. It's a philosophical, metaphysical conundrum. And no matter what you discover empirically, whatever correlations, mechanism, laws, or principles that you might give to solve this problem, the purveyor of the problem always gets to ask, but why? So it seems like the heart problem always allows you to say, but why? Infinitely so. And if that's true, then obviously, then one of two things is going on here. A, science can just stop because they're not in a position to ever solve it, or there's something problematic about this problem. That's what I want to say. We need to give up something has gone wrong in these assumptions, and the question is what? And of course, you can find a philosophical account out there that denies all or any of these assumptions. It'll be clear which ones I deny as we go forward. So what happens is that no empirical account alone, even though we certainly don't have an empirical answer, but no empirical account alone could ever answer this problem. And so what you see happening historically in consciousness studies is that if they don't just deflate or ignore the problem, a scientific theory has to fall back on some metaphysical interpretation, such as panpsychist or strong emergentist versions of IIT, right? So, and you see this in the history, because starting in the 1990s, I have to tell you, I'm going to be as quick as I can, but if I don't tell you what happened and why things have gone the way that they have, the view that I'm selling will seem especially crazy and unwarranted. So I have to do a little bit of this. Hopefully this is history that everybody knows. But starting in the 1990s, people like Crick and Searle said, forget about all this philosophical mumbo jumbo. We're going to solve these consciousness problems the same way we've solved every other problem related to biology. It's called biological naturalism. The idea is that phenomenal consciousness is caused by or realized in the brain. We all know this famous quote from Crick, everything mental is a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated chemistry. This is biological naturalism, or even the identity theory with a vengeance. And so biological naturalism is just good old-fashioned mechanism hunting. The problem is, and there's Searle, right? And he recommends two steps. One, find the NCC, the minimally sufficient neural condition for either a local state of consciousness, such as a visual percept, or the global field of consciousness. Then once you find the NCC, you do what biologists do and you find the magical causal mechanism. That was the game. It didn't pan out that way, at least in some quarters, maybe many quarters of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. Searle's prediction did not come to pass, that this is how everything would go down. And here's a quote from, I think for two reasons, philosophical reasons and empirical reasons. Here's a quote from Christoph Koch where he says, this emergence of subjective feelings from physical stuff appears inconceivable, as in at odds with a basic precept of physical thinking, the conservation law, ex nihilo nihilo fit. In other words, you can't get, there's no consciousness in matter per those assumptions we already looked at. You're not going to get anything out of it. So I think the way I would put it is, many people decided in the beginning, having read Searle and others, they thought maybe they could tell a story about getting consciousness out of brains with merely weak emergence, which is, there's lots of weak emergence in the world. It's about predictive and, limits about derivability and understanding and so on, but it doesn't tell against ontological reductionism. Searle made all these analogies with consciousness in the brain with H2O and water and so on and so on and so on. But I think many, like Christoph, quickly decided that what you would need to do this is some sort of strong emergence, that where somehow consciousness under the right conditions pops out of the brain, and this would be a fundamental fact about the universe, a fundamental new law, a new causal process, something like that. And he and others decided that that was, ridiculously spooky, and therefore there must be something problematic about biological naturalism. So, and he's not alone, as Ravansu points out, even though these neuroscientist people had made it clear that they were going to solve what philosophers had not in thousands of years with biological naturalism, what really actually happened between the 1990s and the present, as Ravansu says, is that the interaction between philosophy and neurosciences went the other way around. And so what happens is at least a certain subset of these cognitive neuroscientists of consciousness started looking to other sorts of theories, not just them, Chalmers and many others decided that biological naturalism couldn't fill the explanatory gap and they needed to go another direction. That other direction was typically involved information theoretic, functionalist, computational, physics-centric theories, as we'll see in a minute. So you can see that what's happening in the science of consciousness is a whipsawing back and forth between various philosophical positions and various explanatory models. And why? One might ask, what happened to biological naturalism? Again, I don't want to oversell this. Plenty of neuroscientists still buy into something like this paradigm. But one of the things that happened was very simply this problem about confounders. because it turned out that even if there is such a thing as a minimally sufficient condition for a local or a global conscious state, that finding that with good old-fashioned Mills methods and knocking things out and so on is really problematic. How do you figure out, which part is just about the phenomenal minimal state of phenomenal consciousness, not attention, not memory, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So that became a real challenge. I mean, that would be a challenge even if the NCC story is true, right? That we're just not in a position to work it out. I think there's reasons to doubt that that story is true more generally. So basically, here's what happened. Many of the areas of the brain that people thought were either necessary or sufficient for minimal phenomenal consciousness turn out not to be. We know this from lesion data, injuries, and so on. And then the other thing that happened is we discovered, not unlike epigenomics, et cetera, that there's nothing like a one-to-one relationship between brain states and conscious states. That's not really a shocker if you paid attention to what's happening in biology more generally, complex biological systems. And so what we have is, what we've discovered is what I would call a real-world multiple realizability. So neuroplasticity of a variety of kinds, neural degeneracy, neural reuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Other animals and insects with radically different neural architectures, we now would believe, most of us believe, do have some minimal phenomenal consciousness. So in addition to the signal to noise problem, the confounders problem I was just talking about, it seems like there's good reason to believe that there's not going to be a one-to-one relationship. Okay, so this led people to, once again, abandon biological naturalism. Not all people, but move back towards biological naturalism, to move back towards more information theoretic, physics-centric, computational accounts like IIT. We could list a whole bunch of accounts under this category. We could spend hours categorizing these different views. Christoph was one of them, even though he was a purveyor of biological naturalism. I want to just stop and say that I think this is, just as a matter of history, this is a super interesting case study in the history of science, because in the course of 20 plus years, so many people abandoned biological naturalism and changed their minds. But then theories like IIT and free energy principle and on seem not to pan out very well also, for reasons I'll discuss shortly. And that led some people like Anil Seth to move back to some version of biological naturalism. You can read about it in his book, which I think is an excellent book, a great book for an overview of the science of consciousness. And he says in this book, essentially, let's forget about the hard problem or the generation problem. Forget about hunting for the NCC. Let's just do garden variety mechanism hunting like we do in biology for some local or global conscious state. We're still going to focus on phenomenology, but we're just going to do good old-fashioned biology. So he would say the goal is to explain, predict, and control the phenomenological properties of conscious experience. So basically, he's selling a manipulationist account of explanation and causation, not uncommon in neuroscience for obvious reasons. Here's how Seth puts it. As we get on with explaining the various properties of consciousness in terms of their underlying mechanisms, perhaps the fundamental mystery of how consciousness happens will fade away, just as the mystery of what is life also faded away. So you can see what the game is here. And you can see that the hope, once again, is that, if we do the science at the end of the day, there won't be a hard problem or a generation problem left. Here is a problem, though. All these theories are problematic. Again, all these things I talk about that I gloss over in these slides in that 65-page paper, that if you dare to read it, I go on about at length. So things that I merely assert here, I try to establish in the paper. But here's the issue. Very few of these theories, any of these theories in any of these categories, make predictions that are novel, precise, and testable in principle or practice. The science of consciousness has not worked out a consistent regime for confirmation and disconfirmation. While the target scientific theories of consciousness, say local versus global, differ, many of them, such as IIT and neural global workspace theory, already have many counterexamples and lots of disconfirming evidence. And some of these theories entail things like simple programs that we could write right now would be conscious, such as hot theories and so on, and probably even global workspace model. Many of us will regard that as a reductio of any such theory. But a lot of these theories have neural disconfirmers and so on. Some theories, such as free energy principle and predictive processing, don't obviously address the generation problem or even the contents of conscious experience problem. They make vague claims about how if the brain is trying to figure out, you're tripping, and your brain is in this new weird, highly entropic state and is trying to figure out what's going on, it sees weird stuff everywhere. But if what you really wanted was a theory of consciousness that very specifically predicts the phenomenology of, say, humans versus bats or humans in certain conditions, we don't have anything like that yet, or so I would say. We do have lots of interesting correlations, say in network neuroscience. We have some interesting possible isomorphisms in the Gestalt school of isomorphism. Lots of really cool stuff there. But we have few compelling mechanistic or principle-based explanations for these correlations, which is just what Christoph Koch was worried about. Okay, maybe someday you'll get these neural correlates, but that doesn't explain anything by itself. We either need something that counts as a clear mechanism, or we need a clear principle type explanation of the sort like IIT is trying to provide. So here's how Seth and Bain, I want to say this because it's not just, I want this to be clear, it's not just me being a curmudgeon as a philosopher. Here's how Seth and Bain summarize the state of consciousness science. At present, theories of consciousness are generally used as narrative structures within the science of consciousness. Although they inform the interpretation of neural and behavioral data, it is still rare for a study to be designed with questions of theory validation in mind. My less charitable way of putting it is, the science of consciousness is in its infancy and there is little to no consensus, which is fine. It's a young science. That's not terrible. And please don't misunderstand. The science of consciousness has made many advances. I'm very impressed by network neuroscience, as you'll see. I think explanatory pluralism is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with any science continuing to seek both constructive and principal explanations in Einstein's terminology. I don't know if we all know this terminology. I'm a philosopher of physics. But basically, Einstein said you have constructive theories that emphasize causal, mechanical, and dynamical, as in differential equations, explanations in physics. And then you have these principal theories, like special relativity. Special relativity just gives you two principles, the light postulate, the relativity postulate, and it gets everything out of that. Einstein was very depressed that he couldn't figure out how to unify Newton and Maxwell and explain this with some story in the same way we think that statistical mechanics, a constructive theory, underlies thermodynamics, a principal theory, but nonetheless, that was the case. But this happens in science all the time. And in quantum mechanics, for example, which I dare say in all humility is further along than consciousness studies, it's still the case that we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea if there's any such thing as a wave function. There's no consensus about what entanglement is or if it's fundamental or not. But we still continue to create, as in the case of quantum information theory, we still continue to create principal theories and reconstructions of quantum mechanics. And it has only broadened and deepened quantum mechanics. So what I'm trying to say here is, I don't think there's any shame in trying all these explanatory strategies in consciousness science, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But forgive me, it seems to me that both philosophical and scientific theories of consciousness are ever circling much the same territory with less forward motion, unification, and consensus than we would like. Some of these things that we're still talking about, like strong emergence and panpsychism, are thousands of years old. And I don't see much improvement, advancement. I don't even see new epicycles. So maybe that's just me. And I have not the first time I've criticized analytic metaphysics. Some of my colleagues do not appreciate it, but nonetheless, that's how it looks to me. It seems to me that people cling to both philosophical and scientific theories that are well past justification. By the way, just to spread the suffering around, I would say this is true about the global workspace theory. It's true about IIT. I think these theories are loaded with empirical counterexamples. And don't even get me started on, quantum theories of consciousness. So ironically, I think the problem is that there's both too much a reductive mindset and too much of a dualistic one. It'll be clear what I mean by that in a second. How did we get here? Suppose you agree with my diagnosis. Well, I think I understand how we got here. You can read this for yourself. But I was guilty of the same thing for many years. We got here because we go back to those assumptions that generated the hard problem. And so if matter's fundamental and there's no magic in the world, as it were, then somehow matter or something related to matter, like information, computation, something in physics or biology, something in neuroscience, just has to be the explainer. This is what we're giving ourselves to explain things with. Matter, the stuff that you can get out of neuroscience, computer science, et cetera, that has to be the story. So whether it's some weirdness of quantum mechanics or some weirdness of non-linear, non-equilibrium thermodynamics or some information theoretic principle, well, that's just gotta be where the story is. Because after all, the other assumption we're making here is, what does it mean to explain things scientifically, right? What does it mean to give a scientific explanation? It's all about reduction, right? To reduce one thing to another. Maybe we do it in terms of dynamical laws. Maybe we do it in terms of causal mechanisms. Maybe we do it in terms of some principle from physics. But that's what science is, right? I would say it's time to rethink scientific explanation. So I appreciate these sentiments. I was a victim of them for a long time as well. And I think if you look at even these philosophical theories like panpsychism and strong emergence, they're really just unworkable patches for physicalism and reductionism. So strong emergence says consciousness pops out of brains somehow. And panpsychism says, oh no, it's a fundamental aspect of matter. But in both cases, you have a type of dualism. And in both cases, you have theories or ideas that are highly problematic. And I might add, have no obvious use to science. I am a metaphysician who thinks that metaphysics is pretty useless if it doesn't inform or is not informed by science in some way. Is there an alternative? Yep, neutral monism. Take me a minute to give there. To appreciate how neutral monism might not be a crazy thing to think, even though William James and Bertrand Russell already thought it a long time ago. We have to, I think, appreciate where we're going wrong in our conception of the physical universe. And that's the bottom line for me. I think that what we're learning from all this is we need to reconceptualize the material world and the mental world and how those things are related, that we've seen enough dead ends that it's time to rethink things. So what do I mean by contextual emergence? It's not merely weak emergence, not strong emergence, which I've already discussed. It's something else. Again, everybody agrees that weak emergence is the norm in science, and most of us think strong emergence doesn't exist. The only place where anybody is willing to even think about the possibility of strong emergence is consciousness. But then you can see, as Christoph Koch and others pointed out, and as Strawson and others have pointed out, you've really got to believe that somehow it's a brute fact about the world that under some condition or given some brand new law that you would have to stick in your fundamental base of explainers, that under the right conditions, consciousness just pops out of insensate matter. But if we stick to our assumptions that generated the hard problem, that seems not possible, at least not physically possible. So what does weak emergence say? It says, contrary to both weak and strong emergence, the relationship between larger and smaller scales need not be anti-symmetric, transitive, or anti-reflexive. In other words, contextual emergence is a rejection of a kind of hierarchical or foundationalist conception of how the world is structured. So on this view, the world is nothing but a network of ineliminably extrinsic multi-scale dispositions. There are no intrinsic properties. There are no essences in such a world. for those of you who are Buddhist, I could just say this is, Buddhist science, if you will. The right way to think about the relationship between smaller scales or quote unquote lower levels and higher scales is that at best, the smaller scales provide a necessary condition at best, but with multiple realizability, maybe not even a necessary condition for a higher level or larger scale phenomenon. So when you have a world like this, emergence is not a crazy popping out of something that is otherwise a reductionist physical world, because what leads to novelty is the fact that the nature of the world is new context, new constraints at multiple scales equals new properties, new processes, and so on. There's nothing in this view about discontinuity or disunity in nature. There's nothing like, the sort of Cartwright, gaps or any of that sort of stuff, because this is just the nature of reality in general. So the best way to think about the world on this view is in terms of multi-scale constraints and context, hence the term contextual emergence. So contextual emergence is a type of scientific explanation and an ontological picture of the world that emphasizes the equal fundamentality of what are often multi-scale contextual constraints and interdependent relations at interacting scales. And we call these constraints stability conditions. Often the behavior things at smaller scales only exist because of stability conditions that stuff is nested in at larger scales. I think the brain is loaded with these sorts of examples. So, but these constraints, they don't have to be causal mechanical or dynamical. They can be global, they can be least action principles. They could be things like conservation laws. They could be things like the principles I discussed in special relativity. They could be global organizing principles such as plasticity, robustness, and autonomy, which we see multiply instantiated in complex biological systems. These constraints could even be behavioral, social, or normative. So what contextual emergence is about, and again, I'm grossly oversimplifying it so I can get through all this. It's about how novel properties are produced and why those properties matter. So contextual emergence calls into question fundamentalist and hierarchical assumptions shared by both weak and strong emergence, and so on. Okay, so it implies a contingent multi-scale web of inextricably interconnected and interdependent extrinsic dispositions. In the book, we tell this story with lots of case studies ranging from physics all the way up through cognitive science and neuroscience. So finally, to network neuroscience, and I know Luis is going to talk about some of this stuff, so maybe I can go quickly. I argue at length in this paper, in the book, and so on, that what we're learning is that about the brain is that cognitive functions are irreducibly multi-scale networks that range from the molecular to the graphical and beyond to 4E, embodied, embedded, extended, and active contexts and constraints. So just sticking to the brain, we've learned, I believe, that RNA, DNA, and protein networks, various types of neuron and glia cells, various types of synchrony and the activity of electrical fields more generally, hormones, neurotransmitters, topological properties of graphical networks, such as small world and rich club networks, all of that stuff working in concert is the ultimate explainer or determiner of how cognition, action, and consciousness works. We can decompose all that for all kinds of useful explanatory purposes, but I think that's what we're actually learning about what we are. So I don't think I'm alone in this. I always like to bring in people who are viewed as hard-nosed neuroscientists because the sort of things I'm saying not very long ago would have been regarded as crazy hippie shit. But when people like Lisa Feldman Barrett say these things, I feel like it's catching on. So what does she say in her well-known book? Your brain is a multi-scale network, a collection of the parts that are connected to function as a single unit. Lots of details to unpack there. Such networks often encompass a variety of spatial and temporal scales, entities, and activities, as well as interactions across scales, and can be used to model brain-wide organization as well as more regional activity. Okay, This is obviously, I have no time to talk about these things, but most of you know this stuff, fortunately. Networks, there's some networks for you. There's your small world rich club networks and so on. One of my heroes in this neck of the woods, unsurprisingly, is Olaf Sporns. I'm sorry about how bad these pictures are. I tried to find people's connectomes online, but I failed, so I had to use an actual image of their face. But I didn't have time to make fancy slides. So what do we learn when we study these networks? I think what we learn is we have multi-scale, codependent, codetermined relations ranging from the molecular to the social. Again, one is free to disagree with that, obviously. We have global, higher scale stability conditions, such as being a small world network. These networks are not reducible to molecular mechanisms, and in fact, are multiply realizable with respect to molecular mechanisms. And you certainly cannot understand these networks in terms of localization and decomposition. So what I want to say here is, contrary to what some neuroscientists want to call a mechanistic explanation, if you think a mechanistic explanation is reductive or entails localization and decomposition, I don't think that's what you're seeing in these network explanations. And you see a lot of multiple realizability, what I would call the universality of things like small world networks, lots of different critters with lots of different brains and lots of different stuff going on at different scales, even very early in the evolutionary process, and come online early in development and in organisms development. You see these networks at work. They definitely transcend any simplistic mechanistic reduction. Again, I'm inserting a bunch of stuff that I try to argue at length in this paper and in the book. So again, here's some pictures that I can't talk about, just to, try to stick an image in your head for those of you that may not be familiar with this stuff. Here's a bunch of stuff I've written over the years on network neuroscience that you can look at. So what is a brain on my view? It's a multi-scale plasticity hub. This is not a catchy phrase. I need a catchier phrase, like the brain is a computer. That's such great PR. I don't believe it, but you can see why it would catch on. The brain is a multi-scale hub and a vaster multi-scale network. So for me, the fundamental thing here is the larger multi-scale 4E network. That's not, the individual brain regulators are not the fundamental thing. And so I think that what the magic of the brain and other things that would play the role of a brain or other nervous systems is the plasticity, the malleability, and the adaptability. I think that's what's key about the magic of the brain. And lots of different mechanisms could fulfill that role. In fact, and now I'm going to sound like an old school functionalist, but I'm not. Mechanisms are historically contingent. We all know this. We know this through convergent evolution and just through plain reasoning. And if we think about not just Earth, but all the other planets out there and the weird life and consciousness that is no doubt out there, I don't have any doubt that lots of things like memory, perception, continuity of self, and so on are mechanistically multiply instantiated, because it just stands to reason from an evolutionary point of view. This is why I say it's a sort of functionalist argument. It stands to reason from the evolutionary point of view that given enough time and evolutionary space to evolve, no matter what the mechanisms or the stuff that, that things are made of, that these sorts of, it's like convergent evolution on a grand universal scale. And again, I'm not alone in thinking this way. As Lisa Feldman Barrett puts it, your brain secretly works with other brains in the world. So what are conscious agents on this view? Well, these networks don't stop at the borders of the body or the brain. They are 4E. Humans are not just brains or bodies, but are spatially temporally extended multi-scale biopsychosocial networks. I know biopsychosocial is a problematic phrase. I unpack it in the paper. So I think it's best to view mammalian brains and other nervous systems as plasticity engines that modulate multi-scale network interactions. Brains are multi-scale hubs of the sort in such multi-scale networks. So what are we? We look more like this. That's what a person is, I would say, from a God's eye point of view. So I can't unpack this now, given the time constraints, which I probably already violated. But I would say that's what a human being is, right? So the individual part is derived from these interactions. This is obviously a gross violation of reductive neuroscience. case it wasn't clear, which is why I don't expect lots of people to appreciate it. But I hope the reason I made the negative case for where we're at is maybe it's a little bit of a motivator to consider something that might seem so far afield. So how does this help with the hard problem or the generation problem? Well, by itself, it doesn't, right? So if the only thing I do to try to fix the generation problem is to add to the supervenience space or whatever, tables and trees and culture or whatever, now the question is, but why does consciousness arise out of all those 4E interactions? So it doesn't by itself fix this problem, but it's a start. And I think it enables something that really finally fixes the problem. So it's a necessary condition for deflating the generation problem. It helps both directly and indirectly. First of all, it helps because the contents of conscious states, which is what I think we ought to be worrying about, not the generation problem, is determined by multi-scale 4E contexts and constraints. Contextual emergence is also a rejection of physicalism, ontological reductionism, causal closure, intrinsic and essential properties. And those are the bugaboos that give rise to the hard problem. So there's, no metaphysics in, no metaphysics out. You can't solve a metaphysics problem with a purely empirical resolution, right? That's why something has to be wrong with the hard problem and the generation problem. One or more of those assumptions has to be wrong, or, we're in the realm of the supernatural and science just can't say anything about it, which of course I don't want to have to say. So that's what I'm trying to do. All right. So we have one more thing to get rid of the generation problem. What really causes the problem is the primary secondary property distinction given to us by Galileo and others, or any version of dualism, right? That's the problem. As long as we maintain that the physical and the mental are essentially different, we're going to be stuck in some version of the mind-body problem or the hard problem. Other views like panpsychism allege to fix this problem, but they do so at the weird cost of making particles or whatever is fundamentally physical conscious. And also they really just move this primary secondary distinction back to physics from brains. I don't really think of that as helpful myself. There is another way, neutral monism. I think this neutral monism, contextual emergence makes neutral monism of William James not seem scary or spooky. I understand why it is natural for mechanists, physicalists especially, to assume that metaphysically speaking, brains cause consciousness. It's such, just as we were convinced that in the case of quantum entanglement, when we collapse or measure one of the entangled states, it must cause the other one to collapse. I think we have lots of reason here to question that the fundamental relationship here is one of causal, right, as in production. Now the sense of causation is production. I think it's time to abandon Reichenbach's principle when it comes to neural and mental correlations. I know that that is a radical thing to suggest for most people, but again, William James suggested it a long time ago and he was no idiot. So I think it's time to give up the idea that brains metaphysically produce consciousness. And as weird as this may sound, I think it's time to give up the idea that consciousness is literally in the brain. So there's William James, very elongated. This guy over here, you probably know about him. I can't spend a lot of time talking about this, but I just want you to get the basic idea. All the things I'm saying to you about what is problematic about the science of the science of the consciousness and strong emergence of panpsychism, William James had already nailed all this stuff. And I would say so had Bertrand Russell. But here's the basic idea. Neutral monism is the idea that the mental and the physical are non-dual, not essentially different, and are neutral in virtue of being neither essentially mental nor physical, and in virtue of the fact that they are grounded in something neutral. I'm not going to tell that story here, what the something is, but you can find it in the book. This ubiquitous something does not pervade space-time or generate space-time because it is co-extensional with space-time. As James put it, subjects knowing, things known are roles played, not ontological facts. It's a weird view to wrap your head around, if you're a dualist of one sort or another, or if you're a qualia fan, it's almost like a Zen koan. It's very hard to appreciate what's being said here because we are so deeply, dualism is so deeply ingrained in us. But from the perspective of neutral monism, the world is not carved at the joints as physical, mental, inner, outer, subject, object. That is not a datum, but a false inductive projection. Again, a weird thing to believe for most people. Subjectivity and objectivity are affairs not of what an experience is originally made of, but of its classification. So-called inner experience is not inherently or essentially mental, and so-called external world is not inherently non-mental or physical. So he wasn't alone in this, right? Russell held every view you can hold in the course of his lifetime. That's what a smart philosopher does who lives long enough, because hopefully one of those views will be right, like, you know, Hillary Putnam. But here's one, at one point, Russell really was a Jamesian neutral monist. Here's what he said. The whole duality of mind and matter is a mistake. There's only one kind of stuff. I would say stuff is a bad word because it connotes substance, but whatever, out of which the world is made of, and this stuff is called mental in one arrangement and physical in another. So I would say when you read James, you know, saying there's no such thing as consciousness, it's not right to read him as an eliminativist, right? What he's really trying to say is subjective experience is not a qualia-like entity that jumps into being fully formed from material processes. Experience evolved along with organisms in a non-dual fashion and became more varied and more complex over time as a function of the multi-scale context reflected in biocultural evolution. It's not a separate thing. There's no such thing as tropes of red or pain or whatever. That's a fiction. I'll say one more thing about neutral monism. I think this quote, which is from Evan Thompson, where he argues that neutral monism is a very old idea. I argue this as well. It dates back to Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, various schools of Buddhism. But I think this quote tries to give you a flavor for this crazy idea. Take a moment of visual awareness, such as seeing the blue sky on a crisp fall day. The ego consciousness makes the visual awareness feel as if it's my awareness. It makes the blue sky seem the separate and independent object of my awareness. In this way, the ego consciousness projects a subject-object structure onto awareness. According to the Yogacara philosophers, however, the blue sky isn't really a separate and independent object that's cognized by a separate and independent subject. Rather, there's one impression or manifestation that has two sides or aspects, the outer seeming aspect of the blue sky and the inner seeming aspect of the visual awareness. What the ego consciousness does is to reify these two interdependent aspects into a separate subject and a separate object. But this is a cognitive distortion that falsifies the authentic character of the impression or manifestation of a phenomenal event. As William James would say, there's just the field of experience. Sometimes he used words that sounded a little sense data-y, which was a mistake, but it's very clear that's not what he had in mind. So, all right. So, what are the implications of contextual emergence and neutral monism? With the generation problem deflated, I'm almost done. We can get on with the science of consciousness. I say the best way to view the relationship between neural processes and conscious ones is as non-dual aspects of a singular 4E dynamical processes in terms of multi-scale and context-sensitive mutual constraints. I'm not alone in talking about constraints these days. Obviously, Bill Bechtel, Jason Winning, Michael Anderson, lots of people have decided that, you know, sometimes causation talk or, you know, other sorts of constructive idioms are best abandoned for constraint talks. While brains do not metaphysically cause consciousness in a variety, cause consciousness in the sense of production, in a variety of senses, there will be many scientifically useful causal relationships between neural activity and conscious states, such as the manipulationist view central to cognitive neuroscience. So look, you should be pluralist about all these things. There's Granger causation. There's all kinds of causal relationships that are useful for the practice of neuroscience. And by the way, there's also going to be all kinds of relationships that are not constructive, like principle-based connections, right? There's nothing wrong with looking for something like IIT, I just don't think IIT is it. I think it's obvious it's not it. I think there's already plenty of counterexamples. There's nothing wrong with looking for these gestalt isomorphisms. But once we have neutral monism on board, these isomorphisms no longer become nutty correlations that are inexplicable, right? If consciousness in the brain is related in the way that I'm suggesting, one would expect these sorts of isomorphisms. There's nothing wrong with looking for other principal theories, other adynamical global constraints, such as being a small world network and so on. I think we can just get rid of the generation problem, get rid of the hard problem, move on with doing the science. So we're now free to rethink, reconceive the science of consciousness. We can now freely explain the question of what experiences are possible for us under what multi-scale conditions. So I would give the analogy of quantum mechanics. As I said to you before, nobody knows what's going on with quantum mechanics, but we moved on and we decided, you know, as people in QIT say, screw art, let's dance. In other words, that means we're never going to figure out the interpretation of quantum mechanics, but we can figure out how to use entanglement. We can make quantum computers. We can figure out all the weirdness and so on. I'm saying we should do the same thing with consciousness. We are just left with the scientific and experimental questions of how and why we experience things as we do. The contents of experience, both global and local, and the significance of those experiences. So now all of these myriad functional, causal, dynamical correlations, there's no reason they can't be explanatory. I would say that the best thing we can do to move forward is to master tools for 4E networks, mapping the key synchronic and diachronic relationships at all these scales. A thing that people are starting to do, like Olaf Sporens. Obviously, a very hard thing to do. So we know that phenomenal consciousness, I say we know, most of us believe that phenomenal consciousness is now ubiquitous, including honeybees and who knows what else, you know, lower in the great chain of being. So maybe there is no heavy duty computational or neuromachinery necessary here for consciousness. Maybe what we need are embodied agents with what people like Jennifer Wint call spatial situatedness or phenomenological personhood, with some sort of sensory apparatus, some very minimal neural-like plastic networks that enable behavior and cognition and adaptability. Maybe consciousness is just that simple. Maybe consciousness is not some magical, crazy, hard problem thing that, you know, is the toughest problem in all of science. I would also say that contextual emergence takes the pressure off of finding some specific or singular, large-scale, integrated, and holistic correlate for the field of consciousness in Searle's sense of or neurophenomenology sense. Why is that? Because I think these 4E systems are self-organizing, self-maintaining, and to use a term of art from people like from ecological psychology, I think these systems are softly assembled, which means I think that on very small timescales, the neurophysiological environmental resources that underlie conscious states, behavior, and action can rapidly change over time. That's what softly assembled means, right? So there doesn't have to be some magical neural synchrony or some magical resonance or whatever these people talk about. Those all might be part of the story, but they don't have to be the only part of the story. So again, swear to God, this is really the last slide. Neutral monism suggests, I know you don't believe me, I've already lied to you. Neutral monism suggests that the science of consciousness will not make progress unless it takes seriously the sweep of conscious experience. Just as radical empiricism, it's another name for neutral monism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and shamanic traditions do. This is true for two reasons. First, ideally, what we want to know is the complete possibility space of conscious experience for humans and beyond, right? So if I smoke my DMT at home, if I do it at a concert, if I do it out in the woods, what's going to happen? If I do it when I'm nervous, if I do it when I'm happy, right? Set and setting. Just think about psychedelics. It's already built into the story about psychedelics. In spite of all of our brain network talk, I'm not saying that those, you know, the neurological stories about entropy and algorithmic complexity aren't helpful for explaining psychedelic experiences, but we all know that that can't possibly be the whole story. So second, given neutral monism, conscious experience is not merely some virtual reality trip in the skull vat generated by neural mechanisms. Experience is reality itself. Experience is not, there are no magical noumena beables hiding behind experience, right? So to explore the possibility space of conscious experience is to explore reality. Therefore, competent and experienced psychonauts, shamans, and meditators should play a greater role in consciousness science, and not just as guinea pigs that we give drugs to and put in fMRI tubes. So the transformative and meaning-related aspects of experience will not be explained away by neural mechanisms. As the term psychonaut suggests, the greatest exploration of all is the exploration of experience space. Such experiences should be mined for knowledge, insight, and wisdom. I'm not saying anything, unsurprisingly, that William James didn't already say in the Varieties of Religious Experience. This is the last slide, for real. Our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, this is such Jamesian language. Maybe he got his brother to write this. There lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus and at a touch, they are all there and in all their completeness. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. Obviously, people who trip or meditate a lot are going to be much more sympathetic to what I'm saying. Perhaps as James suspected, religious and mystical experiences immerse us in realms not normally accessible to us. As he puts it, the further limits of our being plunge, it seems to me, into an altogether other dimension of existence from the sensible and merely understandable world. So I'm going to stop now, but what I have a case study for psychedelics, but you get the idea of what I'll probably say about it. That's it. Thank you.
All right. I think you covered quite a bit of material.
How much time was that?
The what?
How much time did I take?
50 minutes.
Wow. My apologies.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So here's the plan. The plan originally, which I should have mentioned, but I forgot, was that after Michael's presentation, we were going to have 2 brief presentations or commentaries, discussion briefly by Carolyn and myself, and then we would open it to the entire group. So what I suggest instead is that we delve right into Carolyn's questions and comments, and then we open to general discussion. I think that would be a lot more fun. So Carolyn, do you want to say where Michael goes wrong?
Thanks for the tee up. Yeah, so my comments were mostly questions, and so hopefully this is helpful for discussion. So I just have a few questions, and these are not questions for Michael because this is a discussion for the group. These are questions that you may have thought about while we were having this discussion. Actually, let me, Michael, is it okay if you stop sharing your screen?
Sure.
So I'm not going to share slides. I'm going to just like integrate text into my video. I'll just wait till you're done.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see the words now that that slide's not up anymore. Okay. So what I really like about this paper and about this talk is I love the criticisms of theories of consciousness, extant theories of consciousness. I think they're really good. If you get a chance to read the paper, you'll see that there's some really interesting ideas there. I really like anything on contextual emergence. We share that quality. Also, we're both from Oklahoma, so shout out to Oklahoma. Okay. Yeah. But here are some questions that you might have after reading the paper or hearing this talk. So first, there's some of these quotes are from the paper. So I'm hoping that having read the paper will be an advantage to everybody else here. So one of the quotes is about how, in Michael's view, general intelligence and complexity of conscious experience are inseparable. And you might think that that sounds a lot like at least one form of panpsychism. You might also have noticed that Michael is very much against panpsychism. And so one question you might have for yourself is, how does this account avoid the criticisms that Michael levels against IAT and panpsychism? It feels in some ways similar. It's at least a kind of biological panpsychism, or feels like a biological panpsychism. So how does it manage to escape those criticisms? One of the criticisms that Michael levels against all accounts is that they are unable to escape these further why questions. He brings this up multiple times in the paper, that you can always ask this further why question. Why is it that this thing is associated with that thing? So for example, when he's talking about accounts, neural correlate accounts of oxytocin, he says, well, why should oxytocin, let's say, have mental correlates, let alone these particular correlates? No answer is forthcoming. But you could ask the same kinds of questions about this account. So if experience is reality itself, you might ask yourself, well, why? Why are experience and reality connected in that way? You might ask, why in that view is consciousness, why does consciousness seem private to some people? Why does it seem to be like something? There are further why questions in this account too. And so how does this account, another way of putting it is, how does this account do better in terms of escaping why questions? If that's really the problem with these other accounts, is that they can't escape further why questions. Another question you might have is, one of the criticisms Michael levels against a lot of other accounts is that he uses all caps pop in his paper, that there's this problem because they seem to show, especially certain emergent accounts, they take it that experience just pops into existence, and that's a problem for him. So he asks, why does phenomenal consciousness pop into being in those conditions? That seems weird that would happen. But one of the things that I was thinking about in reading the paper is that actually it does sometimes seem like consciousness pops. So sometimes it seems like it's on a spectrum, and sometimes it seems like it pops. So for example, when you wake from anesthesia or sleep, it kind of seems like it pops up a little bit. You might also think that when you see consciousness in another being, that's a kind of pop in your that projection is a kind of pop. It happens kind of suddenly for you. And so Michael correctly criticizes other theories for being too into this pop idea, but maybe a little pop is okay. And does this account really have enough pop, I guess, is the question. And then last question is, where is this link between neutral monism and contextual emergence coming from? So Michael and I share this strong interest in contextual emergence. I'm not as sure about linking it with neutral monism. I see some of the advantages of that, but I wasn't ever really that clear on why exactly they're being linked. So he says in the paper that both reject ontological reduction in favor of pluralistic unity. But to me, it seems like there are different types of reductions and different types of pluralisms. So I'm not really sure why we should map one onto the other. So in contextual emergence, you have a pluralism of spatial scales. But in neutral monism, you have a pluralism of two things that have been taken to be totally different types of things, matter and mind. And it's not clear why we would say that pluralism of spatial scales and pluralism of these types of things are the same kind of thing, that one implies the other. Okay, so that's it. Those are just some questions to raise, and I hope that we're able to have a broader discussion about those questions or other questions people have about this really interesting paper and talk.
Cool. You're gonna have to explain to us how you do this trickery later, but that's something you want to keep it as a secret for a while, I'm sure. Michael, do you want to first maybe address some of these issues before we open to some discussion? Maybe you can, I don't know if it's better to focus on one that you prefer and then we open to discussion instead of going exhaustively, because I view this as a chance for us to have an open discussion. So it's not really that you have to be successful in rebutting the points that were brought up, but it's more just for us to exchange ideas and share these things.
Well, first, let me apologize again for eating up so much time.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Don't worry about it. No, really, it was
I got in that space of, but so, and then to eat up more time trying to answer these questions, but obviously given a choice of which of these, as I counted 6 questions, to answer. I'm going to pick the ones that I think I can answer the most easily. So let me talk about intelligence, relationship between intelligence and consciousness. So, I mean, clearly, we all know, clearly, if you define intelligence in some very broad sense, we can make machines that do what we think of as appropriately programmed or given the appropriate giant database with the appropriate, neural network trickery and millions of trials or whatever. We can make machines that do complex cognitive tasks and can outperform us in some sense in those tasks. But I still think it's true that what Dreyfus and others said, I still think that the state of AI is the following. We still have yet to make a piece of AI, a robot or a box or whatever you want, that has the general intelligence and common sense, to use the lingo of AI, of a lobster. So yes, we have lots of complex, interesting tricks. I don't think they in any way reflect what animals do, like us and other animals. So here's what I think neutral monism strongly suggests, that there's going to be a relationship between complexity of consciousness and complexity of intelligence. Intelligence in the sense of, general intelligence and common sense or what have you. That those things are going to go hand in hand. So I'm rejecting a key assumption of a great deal of artificial intelligence, that you can totally, that the question of intelligence and consciousness are completely orthogonal. I think neutral monism suggests otherwise. As to the question about panpsychism, just stop me whenever you want to jump in or move on or whatever. As to the question of panpsychism, I think my view might, it's an empirical question, suggest a bio, what's sometimes called a biopsychism, which is the idea that, living beings or anything functionally equivalent to a living being that meets some minimal conditions might be conscious. It's an empirical question. It might be true, but it certainly doesn't entail it. Panpsychism suffers from what I call mission creep. So it keeps trying to expand its idea into other ideas like neutral monism. But I want to be super clear and remind everybody, panpsychism is the idea that whatever is physically fundamental, whatever weirdness that is, quantum fields, loops, strings, whatever, that stuff has some sort of proto-consciousness, right? And that, my neutral monism certainly doesn't entail anything like that. For one thing, there's no dualism at work. Panpsychism is a kind of dualism, though they don't like to emphasize that. Sometimes they call it a dual aspect theory, but it's still dualism. Neutral monism, by definition, at least wants to avoid that. What else do we have?
No, let's stop there so that we get some discussion instead of like going to, if you are going to go into other questions.
Yeah, I can do whatever you want.
Is that okay?
Let other
Yeah.
people jump in.
So there are several hands already up. Let's go in order from what I have here in my monitor. I think Brady was first, and then Kevin and Johan, and then Ben.
Yeah, thanks for that talk. That was really interesting. I'm an imager at UC, so I was brought up in ecological psychology, but do neuroimaging work. I very much consider myself a network neuroscientist, or at least attempting to be a network neuroscientist. I really liked your historical account of this stuff. I too am a huge fan of James and think that he was way ahead of his time in this, network kind of theory. But even farther than that, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who was like the founder of the neuron doctrine, who's the most hardcore neuroscientist, also mentioned the importance of networks in some of his papers. So I think it goes even deeper than like the psychological side of things. I think some of the hardcore neuroscientists like Ramon y Cajal and Hebb and Geschwind and some of these guys really touted these ideas early on. The one thing I did want to mention is even with network neuroscientists, I noticed that some people are guilty of, and not Olaf himself, but some of his students like Martin van den Heuvel and even Daniel Bassett and some of the current giants in network neuroscience, even they're guilty of kind of phrenological network approach is kind of how I like to think of it. So like, you know, what's the difference between saying this area in the brain is responsible for language versus like this network in the brain is responsible for language, right? I just think that's the wrong way to think about things personally. So even with the network neuroscientists, I think it's important to be wary of that kind of contextualization around these networks. Eventually, I hope that we get over that. I think connectionist theory from the 80s will help to do that. But until then, you know, just something to keep in mind. But yeah, so I just wanted to make those comments. I don't have any specific questions, but yeah, thanks again for the talk. It was really interesting.
Well, thanks for all that. I really appreciate it. And the only thing I can say in response is I agree with everything you said. And I agree, of course, with you, and I try to argue it at length that there's not going to be any one-to-one relationship between, you know, like default mode network and sense of self or whatever. So I agree.
All right, Kevin, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk, Michael. That was great, really interesting. I hadn't come across the term contextual emergence before, but it absolutely makes sense to me, and I think it's the right sort of way of getting away from both reductionism and dualism, and seeing that those are not our only options. And I would say, you know, thinking of constraints as causes, not as an alternative to causes, but as a type of cause, is a perfectly legitimate way. You know, just the way things are organized is a fundamental causal property of how they, you know, respond to things and behave. So I'm very happy to see that. The neutral monism bit left me scratching my head a little bit, and maybe just was the speed of delivery there. And I guess I'll have to dig into that a little bit, but I guess I was left a little like Carolyn, not quite sure about the relationship between those two things. It doesn't seem like there's a necessary relationship. But ultimately, I guess, while, you know, convinced that this contextual emergence is the right way to think about multi-scale brains and so on, and that the enactive approach is the right way to think about why, you know, how organisms can have grounded meaning of neural states through experience and so on, it still left me with a bunch of why questions, and it didn't feel like it was an explanation of consciousness. It was, I think, eroding some of the difficulties that lead to the so-called heart problem. I think that's good, but I'm still left wondering, okay, but why does it feel like something, right? To have a neural state that corresponds to you know, experiences of things in the world. Why does that feel like something, and why does it feel the way that it does? And maybe why does it feeling like something have some value to the organism, as opposed to, you know, a robot with control signals configured into it that it can use to guide its behavior? Would a robot configured in that way necessarily be having subjective experience? Or, you know, what do we get from it? So I guess I was left with some mystery still.
So thank you for those comments. So let me just jump to the chase and admit, as Carolyn and you suggested, there certainly is no necessary connection between contextual emergence and neutral monism. And neutral monism is the part of the story that's doing a lot of the work to answer your questions. I would have to do an entire, I think, talk focused on neutral monism and William James and Russell and all that to really bring it all out and to try to get people to appreciate it. But I think the connection between contextual emergence and neutral monism is contextual emergence. Neutral monism is, again, people are so convinced that of those fundamental assumptions that lead to the generation of the heart problem. And built into that is the fundamentality of matter, and built into that is a kind of dualism, because matter is essentially not conscious, and yet consciousness exists. That the very idea of neutral monism is a mind blower until you reject those assumptions. And I think what contextual emergence does is it enables, you know, it enables the possibility, once you get rid of ontological reductionism, physicalism, things like essences, all the metaphysical, right, and empirical assumptions that go into the heart problem, then it clears the way for something like what James was talking about. It makes it at least possible that neutral monism is true and not nutty. So how does neutral monism help? Well, neutral monism is a deflation of the heart of the generation problem, right? The idea that matter is fundamental and that it is essentially insensate is false. The idea that matter and consciousness are essentially different is false, right? So what do you start with in neutral monism? You have the field of experience itself. His word experience. Don't read that into sense data or idealistic sense. So what is the mystery to be solved on neutral monism is why is there a carving of this into subject and object? So the idea here is you only get a self. It's almost Kantian, except you don't have some categories in the mind or cognitive rose-colored glasses doing the work. You only get a world and a quote unquote external objective world of experience and a quote unquote internal, subjective sense of self when a division is somehow made, right? And people like Jennifer Wendt and others who do research on dreams and so on, they point out that even in the weirdness of the dream state, there's some spatiotemporally situated self moving around in an external environment. The self can change all the time and be weird, and perspective can change, the environment changes all the time, but that basic phenomenology applies, right? Others who have studied, the importance of being embodied for conscious experience, they talk about, they point out the phenomenology, the fact that, when you wake up from deep sleep, as, Carolyn said, when you pop awake, as it were, what's going on? You immediately have a self or a subject moving around in an external environment. When you go into meditation, and you go into a deep meditative state, both of those things go away. There's something left that's experiential. I don't know what to call it, pure being, presence, or whatever. When you come out of that state, what comes back together, right, is a subjective self and an external world. So the idea here is there is no consciousness popping out of matter on this view. There's no consciousness hiding in particles. They're non-dual, okay, from the very beginning. This is the nature of reality. And all you have to do is explain the experience of a subject and an object. Now, if anyone is inclined towards materialism, reductionism, or whatever, you're not going to like this view. The only thing I can say to you is, as you rightly suggested, you can talk about all the contextual emergence you want, but if you don't give up any of those assumptions that leads to the heart problem, it's not going to help.
Right. So in a way, the why question doesn't go away, but it turns into explaining why there is this subjective objective split in some sense, right? So I mean, it's sort of like redirecting in that putting the energy in explaining that, as opposed to, because otherwise there's always going to be some why issue, right? So is that seem
that's absolutely right. And the idea here is that if you take neutral monism on board, the why questions become empirical questions.
I see.
So that's the bit that's troubling me, Michael. I don't see any sort of empirical suggestions for tractable experiments coming from that view. And I have to say, and this is going to sound a bit harsh, but I mean, you describe yourself as a metaphysician who wants to do, empirically useful metaphysics. And when it comes to phrases like experience is reality itself, as a scientist, that just leaves me cold. I have to say, I don't know what to do with that. That is just supremely unhelpful in any sort of empirical project, which is why I guess I'm left scratching my head a little bit at that kind of view, because it's just doesn't feel like it's sort of precise enough to be actionable for me. But anyway, I'll leave it there. I see other people wanting to get in. And thanks a lot.
The only thing I'll say is, think about those last few slides where I did try to say how I think, this could change what we think of as consciousness science and how some of the things that we might do with consciousness science. But sure, turning this directly in, hey, give me a crucial experiment to do. Yeah, I agree that takes some extra work.
Yeah, so before we go to Johan, I think that's an interesting interesting point, which puts back the requirement on you of coming up with some empirical or some type of description that makes stronger contact with the science. Like the way Kevin described it is like it's equally baffling to me. It's okay, I understand these words, but it's not actionable in terms of myself or the group of people I interact with in terms of what do we do with this? How do we translate this into some program of? So I think maybe that can help you in developing further these ideas to think about that. Johan.
Thanks. That was a great talk, Michael. I really liked it, and I come from a physics background. Before I was a computational neuroscientist, I was in physics, and that was my first introduction to the concept of emergence. I had a professor who was a condensed matter physicist, and so when I entered the neuroscience world, I was quite baffled that people wanted to use the concept of emergence in the most difficult places like life and mind without grounding the notion somewhere else. Ideally, in my head, it was physics would show the way, and particularly condensed matter physics. And so I'm going to ask a question sort of related to this sort of back to emergence, basically, which you mentioned in the beginning. And you say that you kind of want to get rid of hierarchy. So my question so I ran a kind of journal club on emergence, and I looked at like ecological perspectives, physics, and a bunch of different angles on emergence. And one thing that kept coming up was that scale or level is a really useful concept, but it's not clear what exactly those concepts mean. Like the more you use a concept, the more you're like, hang on, what exactly is scale or level? So that's like the basic question, and hopefully something that relates to that. It might not, but so it might be part two. Is you seem to distinguish. You don't want to go down the road of strong emergence, but you do mention novelty. So one could ask what the difference is between novelty and strange emergence. Sorry, strong emergence, not strange emergence. And I sometimes think of it in terms of levels, not so much ontologically as epistemologically. But please, yeah. What do you think about levels, basically?
Thank you, Johan. So let me just start with the condensed matter theory. There's a very long, this is just me trying to get you to buy this book. There's a very long chapter in the book on condensed matter theory and quantum entanglement. Because I think condensed matter theory, I think I've said this before in talks where Luis and Carolyn will or whatever, and I talk about it in the book. But if you think about a lot of the tricks of systems neuroscience, you know this obviously, and complexity-based neuroscience, they all come from condensed matter theory and quantum field theory, right? So, renormalization. I mean, universality classes, we could spend hours talking about this. But there is a host of mathematical tricks that are now being applied in neuroscience, and I'm glad to see it. It's awesome because there's no reason why these tricks can't work for other many-bodied systems. It doesn't have to be about electrons or Einstein condensates or whatever. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a good place to. But what I think you learn from condensed matter theory and quantum more generally, but especially in condensed matter theory, is it's all about multi-scale context, right? Because how do we get these quantum systems to do this weird ass stuff? Well, we mess with temperature, we mess with pressure, right? We change all these, upper scale, higher level features, right? And then we get macroscopic stuff to act like quantum stuff, and we get quantum stuff to act like macroscopic stuff, right? So I think it vividly illustrates multi-scale contextuality and contextual emergence. As to your question about words like, and in the book, we bend over backwards and talk about this at length, again, just by the book. As many philosophers have pointed out, words like scale and level they just have multiple meanings. So, I mean, they are ambiguous and they're open to interpretation. You just have to be very careful. Level is super ambiguous because it could be functional, it could be structural. I could go on and on. I like scale better because we can very clearly tell you what we mean by the Planck scale, we can very clearly say what we mean by spatiotemporal scales. We can quantify that. Now, when we talk about consciousness and scale, things get weird immediately, right? I mean, is consciousness macroscopic? We tend to think that way because it's associated with nervous systems, but I suspect the notion of scale does not obviously import over to consciousness very easily.
Johan, you want to follow up with anything, or?
Well, just like,
Yeah.
do these various notions of scale help you flesh out a little bit the difference between novelty, which you do kind of think is real, I think, and strong emergence? Because I think those are very close.
Right,
in
I
my
forgot
head.
novelty, I'm senile. So I would say, I think you suggested this when you said epistemological. And in the book, there's a whole thing about, this is what Jaegwon Kim says about emergence, and novelty is one of those things, and we talk about it. But I think the word novelty I just don't think it's very helpful, because novelty is cheap, right? So hence epistemological. So, think about, classic finite automata like Conway's Game of Life. There's plenty of novelty there, right? You get gliders and all these other crazy things that you would never have predicted, and are qualitatively novel with respect to, the fundamental rules and the black and the white particles and all that. But so I think novelty is cheap. It's everywhere. I mean, that's what weak emergence in part is about. Lots of systems with simple rules and simple components evolved over time can lead to novel things. So novelty doesn't really distinguish between types of emergence by itself.
Ben, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying I have to run right now. But thank you for letting me join. Take care.
Thanks for joining us, Ben.
All right, maybe another time. Thanks. All right.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So I'm one of these Buddhist meditators you were talking about, as well as a computational neuroscientist, just to kind of expose my positionality. And I really appreciated the talk, and I appreciated a lot of the emphasis on changing kind of the way we ask questions, and the emphasis on contextual emergence, and even neutral monism, and thinking about a deeper exploration of subjective experience is a really important part of the study of consciousness, kind of the other side. We can take our simplest assumptions about what conscious experience is, and then look for material kind of causes or correlations of those. But what we find is going to be limited by the level of understanding we have of conscious experience. My question was, or like sort of a question and a comment, and the question aspect of it is that I think that when you talk about thinking about the kinds of questions that neutral monism raises, it brings teleology kind of into play, and I think that that's actually both a really important part of understanding consciousness itself, and also an important part of understanding the kinds of questions that we ask about consciousness, which I think is something that you've kind of revealed a little bit. And I guess I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what, if our goal is not reductive and analytic, I guess my question is, what are the kind of, if you've thought about what goals are associated with reductionism, and what goals are might be associated instead with a different perspective, with neutral monism, and what goals we might choose. So
Thank you. That's the kind of stuff I was trying to get at the end when I was talking about varieties of religious experience. So, and James, I mean, like I said, it's almost built into the definition of scientific explanation for many people that it's got to be reductive in some way. That's what it means to explain. And part of what I wanted to try to show is, well, if that's the case, we are failing horrendously when it comes to phenomenal consciousness. Maybe it's just a function of ignorance. Maybe it'll all get better or whatever. but I think it's systemically built in to fail in that way because of the assumptions that we're making. So we need, a different way to look at it. But to answer your question directly, like if somebody said to me, hey, I want to know what can I do with consciousness, right? Again, this quantum entanglement analogy. I don't know what the hell it is. I don't know how it relates to brains, whatever. But I want to know how to use this shit. Like, how do I learn how to maximize and manipulate and control experiences? Who would you go talk to? Would you talk to a philosopher? Would you talk to a neuroscientist? No. You'd go talk to a qualified shaman, which, be careful because there's a lot of unqualified ones out there. You'd go talk to a person who was really competent to teach you Buddhist or some Buddhist or Hindu form of meditation and to teach you those traditions. These are the traditions, right, that have most learned how to, what can I do with this stuff? Hey, I want to go talk to machine elves and be in these crazy fractal worlds. What do? Smoke a little DMT, right? I want to have the state of pure being and samadhi. Do this form of meditation. And what I'm saying is, I think it's a richness of experience. We often complain about theories of neuroscience, especially local ones that focus on sensory stuff, that they grossly fail to explain the richness of our actual visual experience, for example. I think that problem is ridiculously more obvious in the case of psychedelic and meditative experiences, right? It's like, okay, so all these experiential, networks involving perception, are talking to each other more. And then I go and I read about like somebody who smokes DMT, and they have these very common experiences of talking to these crazy, weird entities, right? In these crazy universes. And your answer to that, neuroscience, is all these networks all talk to each other now. Then why am I seeing praying mantises wearing doctor coats? There's no way that predictive processing or neuroscience begins to get at that. And maybe they will, right? It's an empirical question. But what worries me is the arrogance of neuroscience, which you saw in the 1990s. Forget philosophy. We're going to explain all this stuff now in terms of neural mechanisms, which they immediately abandoned and then went back to all these nutty philosophical theories. So part of what I'm saying to you is, whatever neuroscience, I don't think neuroscience is the key to consciousness. I think it's given my multi-scale contextual emergence, neutral monist approach, I think it's a very important thing. I don't think they will ever reduce or explain away these experiences. And I think part of what consciousness science should be about is expanding in the way that William James suggested, to be about, hey, what can I do with this consciousness stuff? What kind of experiences can I have? And we already know that these things, to your point about teleology, Western psychiatry and psychology, we already know, is back to using psychedelics, right, in therapeutic contexts. And while we need a lot more data and there's a lot more to be done, we can see that, these altered states have profound teleological and psychologically efficacious, effects and transformations in people. I don't believe, and a lot of it is about, this was the test case I was going to do at the end. You look at this data, it's not primarily about how it changes your brain. Of course, that's part of it. I would say that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. It's how it changes people's worldview, their sense of meaning, purpose, emotional valence, and so on. So I'm just suggesting what to many neuroscientists, of course, will be a non-starter, that you're just not in a position to reductively explain all this. And what's really important, as these Asian traditions and these shamanic traditions have known for thousands of years, is, hey, how can I play with this stuff? What can I do to change my mind, as it were?
Ben, do you want to follow up, or?
No, I think I'll cede my time to whoever's next. Thanks for that answer.
Theodore, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. There's the one thing strikes me, because I come at this in a very unorthodox way, is that we're not talking about consciousness. we're talking about human consciousness, and I want to make that distinction. I think it would be very hard for us to imagine what kind of consciousness a bat has or a bumblebee has. And it appears to me that there's more than one thing that we're talking about here. There seems to be like a base level of consciousness, and then there seems to be something on top of that, okay? That there's a kind of proto-consciousness that other animals might have, it's excluded from the kind of richer experience that we have in terms of consciousness, because we have so many add-ons. We have things like language, not that other animals don't have a type of language, but I recall this, there was a book out, and I can't recall the name of the author right now, but it's a very interesting study about how people in Nicaragua didn't have sign language, and they invented their own language. They invented their own form of sign language because that's what happened. And within a second generation, they were building on this in a way that started to develop concepts like, what is a belief? And they had these notions of things, but they were inventing words to talk about that. And so when we're studying consciousness, and again, I hate the word. I think when we've broken it down to consciousness and unconsciousness, what are we really talking about? We haven't identified anything. We've taken this philosophical term, and we're not using really scientific terms. And I'll live with that for now. But my suggestion is that we're only talking about this human consciousness that we're focused on. We're not talking about something that would be more of a base kind of consciousness. And I'd like to hear, maybe you could address those thoughts, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that, as I was saying, I'm going to use the word most of us, I think, now believe that, I'm sorry to use the word, I don't know how else to designate it, but most of us believe that lots of critters, even jumping spiders, honeybees, etc., have some sort of phenomenal consciousness. As you say, it's very hard to know what it's like to be them or a bat or whatever. But the bet that most scientists are making now is that they do. I think we can very well ask the question, I think you're asking it too, what are the minimally sufficient conditions for anything to have some sort of phenomenal consciousness? I placed my bet. It's going to be some sort of embodied critter with some sort of sensory apparatus and some sort of highly plastic internal system. That's my guess. Obviously, it's an empirical question. But I say that because, in spite of all the weird theories of consciousness we talk about, what's the one thing we actually know is that, or believe is that phenomenal consciousness, there's a what it's like to be, is correlated with what I just said, embodied and active beings in an environment with a certain kind of nervous system and so on. But to the rest of your question, why is our consciousness different from chimps and honeybees and blind mole rats and so on? Can we ever know exactly what it's like to be them? Well, probably not. I think we should try. But I think the differences between these types of consciousness is what contextual emergence is all about, right? Like once you have language, as you said, that profoundly affects the nature of your consciousness and what you can experience. If your vision extends into IR or UV, right, profoundly affects echolocation. You're flying around, you're living under the water, you're making bubble art or whatever dolphins are doing, right? So I think we can at least try to triangulate on these contexts, put everything we know together about their neurophysiology, their bodies, their sensory apparatus, and we can do the best that we can to infer what it's like to be them. I don't think we can do any better than that, but it's important to try, I think.
Thank you. Great presentation, great session. Thank you.
Thanks, Theodore. I think this is after an hour and a half. Some people are much later in other places of the world. I don't know if there are any final issues that we would like to, I'm still happy to, if there's some questions, especially from those who haven't been able to ask yet. I think Leslie had Am I still there?
I see you.
No,
I think
I,
Leslie left. I think she had to
my screen disappeared for a second, so I don't know. Yeah, Leslie, Leslie had a few questions, but she had to leave. So Michael, one thing that I want to make sure that you get from her questions, I'll try to see if I can gather the chat later, is that again, is the feeling of, and then magic happens somewhere also in your account. It's like in the sense that it'd be good to get her to spell it out, but in a sense that I guess this objective, subjective type of why question is going to substitute the other challenges that we have with the other classes of explanations. But it doesn't seem there's some kind of the mystery. I guess saying that there is no mystery is I guess is going to be convincing to a subset of us, maybe, but a lot of people are not going to be are going to desire that you articulate that in a way that at least tries to address that more explicitly. Yeah, this magic happen, as Ben is putting there in the chat. So I don't know if you have any quick reaction to that, this issue of why do we just have to step back from that, and why does your take doesn't entail some of its own version of that?
Well, neutral monism, so I think the short answer is, to make some of these questions go away, I've got to spend a good deal of time just trying to get you to appreciate neutral monism and to persuade you that it's not crazy. Because again, one barrier to this is our physicalist and dualistic thinking simultaneously makes it very hard for us to appreciate it. So I think I would have to do that. There's some of that in the book and certainly in other things that I've written. But here's what I would say. Neutral monism definitely, as a matter of logic, deflates the hard problem and the generation problem. But as you said, that doesn't mean that there's nothing left to explain. I don't think there's any fundamental metaphysical mystery left. But I think there's plenty to explain, like that subject to object cut, right? And you want to hear more about it, which I get.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know, Carolyn, do you want to have some final say as to where we are? I mean, this is, have we solved the mystery? Not yet.
I don't think we've solved the mystery, but I do think people should read Michael's book.
All right. Okay, that's
the important thing from my point of view.
That's a perfect place to stop, and I think that there's plenty of things for us to continue discussing. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you very much for all the comments. Super helpful. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for hosting, Louise.
No, of course.
Carolyn, we'll talk more about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool.